Hi, welcome to the Elvis Conspiracy. I'm Jeff Dixon. We're walking through the timeline that talks about the day before the death of Elvis, and then the day after the death of Elvis. And now we're at August 18th, 1977. 2 days after the death of Elvis Presley. Flags were ordered to be flown at half-mast that day by the governor of Tennessee, Ray Blanton. And so, for Tennessee's favorite son, they were lowered to half-mast. At 2 p.m., the services started that day at Graceland. 2 hours later, the funeral procession left Graceland, headed for the Forest Hill Cemetery. The procession had a white Cadillac hearse, and as we talked about in an earlier episode, they were followed by 16 white Cadillac limousines. There were 5 official pallbearers. And that's interesting because when you see the photographs that you're going to be seeing, even as we talk about this, there are certainly more than 5 people carrying that casket. And so let me make a couple of thoughts about August 18th. There's always been speculation as to why they actually had the service at Graceland. I mean, it was obviously a situation where a lot of people knew Elvis. It was going to be a well-attended but private funeral. Fans were not invited to the funeral, but it was held at Graceland instead of a church or somewhere else that might be maybe more appropriate for that to take place, and yet Graceland became the hub of all that activity. Speculation is it was much better to control things behind the gates than it would have been if Elvis would have been moved to a larger church in the downtown Memphis area, an arena for a funeral service, as other rock stars that we can think about in recent years have been buried in, or theaters, if you will. And the funeral was held at Graceland. Though much of the material researched, there are obviously 16 white Cadillacs. Why white Cadillacs? Funerals usually are 16 black Cadillac. Maybe that's why Vernon was overheard saying that he could only get 16 white limousines, and that's all that he had come up with. Those who speculate on conspiracy remember the song Mystery Train by Elvis Presley, where the phrase in the song, 16 coaches long, bringing me back home, is mentioned. For Vernon, it was just a very odd kind of conversation. It is said, when he tried to explain where those Cadillacs came from and how quickly they got there. Gene Smith, who was Elvis's cousin, also had seen Elvis and played racquetball with him the night before he died, had a very interesting interview and conversation where he basically stated that when he saw the body of his cousin Elvis in the casket, he knew for certain it wasn't the body. At one point he talked about the sideburn not being attached very well, and at one point someone had to go over and push it back down like it had been glued in place. He said he looked at the hands of Elvis Presley and the hands were all wrong. He said he'd seen Elvis the night before. The hands were a little bit chiseled. He had broken a few fingers doing karate over the years, and yet these hands were smooth and didn't look like it. He went on to say that you could even see the glue lines in his hair, and he was asked, was it a wax dummy? And he said, I think it is. And that was his comment as to what he saw that night or that day in the casket. One of Elvis's friends, it was reported by Gail Giorgio Brewer, who wrote a book entitled Is Elvis Alive?, who released an audio tape of Elvis supposedly having a phone conversation with her after his death. And one of Elvis's friends said to Vernon, according to her report, that they knew that it was not Elvis in the coffin, and that Vernon had told him that Elvis was upstairs. The coffin itself, incredibly heavy. An average coffin is a little bit over 6 feet long, 28 to 38 inches wide. On this particular day, There was a special delivery that was delivered to Graceland, a block of dry ice that was delivered. And there is a discrepancy as to the weight of what the coffin in the body of Elvis Presley should have been, where it is believed that there was something else in that coffin that they used that day that was somehow used to make that body of Elvis Presley look a little bit different than it was supposed to. You say, what are you talking about? Well, under the lights, a wax dummy, it looks like it sweats or melts, right? And the thought is that the dry ice deliveries and those blocks of ice were used in the bottom of that coffin, which caused that coffin to be incredibly heavy, heavier than most, bigger than most. Remember, a specially created coffin that was already in place prior to the death of the most famous rock star or entertainer on the planet. It was already in Graceland. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's famous manager, showed up that day. He was very unemotional, although Elvis had been his ticket, if you will, to fame and millions. He showed up for the funeral in a loud, short-sleeved Hawaiian shirt and a baseball cap. The Colonel is an interesting figure. We'll talk about him specifically in one episode, but he was an illegal citizen from Holland. He changed his name after he arrived in the United States. Colonel Tom Parker was the one who took Elvis's career and made Elvis the star that he was in many ways, and yet the Colonel had changed his name when he arrived in the United States, and most of the family that he knew back in Holland believed that he was actually dead. They believed that he had been dead for a number of years. As a matter of fact, it wasn't until Elvis Presley became so prominent and people began to see this man called Colonel Tom Parker that they began to realize that this was a man that they had known back in the day in Holland, and that includes his family, who didn't know he was still alive. Speculation is that who better to help Elvis fake his own death than a man who had faked his own years before, a man who had guided Elvis's career. Does it fit into the narrative? Well, maybe. But there are enough people who were close to Elvis that saw him and saw the aftermath of the death of Elvis Presley that raised questions that still linger to this day. Is it easy to push them aside and simply say, they're crazy? Sure, you can. As time has gone by, most of them have passed away. But the things that they said and the things that they shared are entered into part of what is a historical narrative. Remember earlier in our series we asked the question, could you build a case that would begin to present evidence that Elvis Presley didn't die that day but was still alive? It's easy to say that he was dead. And so, those are the days surrounding the life and the death of Elvis Presley. Those are the moments, the incidences of things that took place. Is there evidence behind those things? Is there more to look at? Is there more to uncover, unravel? Sure. It's a part of the conspiracy. And that's where we go next in the Elvis Conspiracy in our next episode.